Many analysts, and I mean a lot of them, argue that the so-called war on drugs has been a complete failure. After all, not only has drug consumption increased, but production has also gone up. So is the anti-drug policy a fallacy? And this narrative is predominant today among universities and the media, but it is a blatantly false narrative. Because simply put, the truth is that the so-called war on drugs has never actually targeted the financial root of drug trafficking, which is the end user, the consumer. In Western countries, most of the efforts are focused on suppressing the supply, that is, producers and traffickers, while internal demand has remained high. There are two clear reasons for that. The first is the normalization and even a certain glorification of drug use by the media, portraying it as something normal and harmless to people. And the second is that the attack was only on the logistics side of drugs, which meant that stable or increased consumption combined with the loss of goods in this logistics process caused the price to go up. It became attractive to ambitious, unscrupulous people seeking quick money, even if it meant taking risks. When more drugs are seized, prices rise. This increases the number of people interested in participating in this market and, as a consequence, increases the number of people encouraging others to use drugs. With the price increase, capital rules also apply. If demand goes up, supply will try to keep up with that increase. And if supply is affected by logistics and doesn't reach the end consumer, then the price for the end consumer increases, encouraging more people to produce the product. This means that the losses during transportation of this product, such as police seizures, are compensated for and diluted by a constant increase in production. This has led to entire countries becoming economically dependent on the money generated by drug trafficking. In the United States, although drug-related arrests rose sharply from 1972 to 2002, the number of people jailed for drug offenses increased 12-fold. During this period, drug offenses accounted for half of the growth in the prison population, while the availability of narcotics did not decrease. On the contrary, the prices of cocaine and heroin reached historic lows and their purity increased even after decades of traditional repression. And this American reality is now spreading throughout Europe and Latin America. In the West, drug users are often treated as patients to be rehabilitated or simply do not face severe penalties for personal use. Several countries have adopted harm reduction policies or decriminalization for small amounts in possession or if the use is for personal purposes, prioritizing public health over punishment. And although it's a beautiful and humanitarian discourse, using morality to override punishment. We can summarize it as sending a message of tolerance toward use, aiming to discourage people from consuming drugs. In a real war, you hit not only the soldier on the front line, but also their logistics and, most importantly, their economic source, while also affecting their psychological state. Media warfare is a basic rule in any war. In the West, the real economic driver of trafficking goes unchallenged, and drug normalization isn't addressed. The real source of drug trafficking money is the user. The fundamental failure of supply-side strategies lies in their inability to identify. The war on drugs metaphor is flawed, not because fighting drugs would be impossible to win, but because there was never a real war, only rhetoric. The user's wallet is the primary, unique, and irreplaceable source of funding and power for traffickers, supporting the entire global narcotics infrastructure, from production fields and distribution networks to cartel violence. Punishing traffickers without reducing user demand will never change the market. In other words, this fake war has focused more on the suppliers, while the consumers who finance trafficking have not been confronted with the same intensity. Meanwhile, countries with a zero-tolerance stance, especially in Asia and the Middle East, harshly criminalize the end user, applying severe penalties such as imprisonment, forced labor, and even the death penalty for possession and consumption. This disparity in approach is central to understanding the differences in outcomes between nations that are lenient with users and nations that are ruthless with any involvement with drugs. Since the mid-2000s, the clash between more lenient Western policies toward users and Eastern policies of total intolerance toward drugs has intensified. Western countries, including the United States, Canada, much of Europe, and especially submissive to the ideological interests of Europe and the United States, gradually adopted less punitive approaches toward the average user. In the United States, although there is a history of punishing drug possession, several jurisdictions, mainly at the municipal level, have decriminalized or legalized the personal use of certain drugs. And they have implemented needle exchange programs, supervised consumption sites, and medication-assisted treatment for addicts. European countries such as Portugal decriminalized and legalized all drugs in 2001, prioritizing treatment. And Canada and some United States states are investing in what we could literally call embracing and caring for the user, making the fight against drugs a public health strategy, not a matter of police repression. Singapore and Indonesia apply the death penalty to traffickers, and repeat users face prison and compulsory hospitalization. China carries out massive repression campaigns, with users being sent to forced rehabilitation centers. While the United States and its European allies were in Afghanistan, it was the world's main heroin source and had among the highest numbers of users. With huge cracklands spread across the main cities of the country, a problem that was solved by the Taliban in less than a year, literally destroying 99% of the poppy production, which is the source of opium for heroin, being eradicated. And the cracklands that existed in the country simply disappeared. Countries like South Korea even punish consumption abroad. South Korean citizens who use drugs outside the country can be prosecuted. Upon returning, this zero tolerance creates a strong deterrent effect. The very fear of severe legal consequences will discourage potential users. And we can't forget the role of the media in these countries, which is different from the West. Movies, television series, and soap operas don't usually show or glorify drug use. And when famous people are caught using these substances, even in tiny amounts, it becomes a scandal, and that person's career simply disappears. In the Western Hemisphere, at least for now, one case is interesting, that of El Salvador, although it doesn't involve illegal drugs. Only since 2022, the Salvadoran government launched a massive crackdown on gangs and organized crime, suspending legal guarantees and arresting tens of thousands of suspects en masse. And by reforming, this is the most important part, by reforming its judiciary, the country saw a dramatic drop in crime. In 2023, a homicide rate of just 2.4 per 100,000 inhabitants was recorded, the lowest in the Americas. Just 5 years earlier, we would have been talking about 53 deaths per 100,000 inhabitants. And, as expected, this iron-fisted strategy was followed by criticism from left-wing intellectuals and journalists with allegations of human rights abuses. But it exemplifies the philosophy of zero tolerance that many Eastern countries also apply to the issue of drugs. The belief that harsh repression brings order and security, drastically reducing indicators of violence and crime associated with it. Drug consumption statistics reinforce the differences in approach. Western countries show much higher prevalence of use than Eastern countries. The United States is the largest consumer of illicit drugs globally, with estimates that about 6% of the population uses illegal drugs regularly. With 1 in every 7 Americans having tried some illicit drug at some point in their lives, a scale of use unparalleled globally. Several European countries also have a high number. Roughly 5% of people in the United Kingdom and 6% in Canada use illicit drugs. Even in Brazil, where personal use is not heavily penalized, approximately 1% of the population suffers from drug use disorder. These Western rates contrast frighteningly with the numbers found in hardline anti-drug countries. Asian and Middle Eastern nations report pathetically low percentages of drug users. For example, Singapore reported in a study a prevalence of only 0.7% of the population using drugs in recent years. Numbers far below the levels observed in the United States, Europe, or Australia. Similarly, China claimed to have only 0.1% of its population as drug users in 2021, dropping to about 0.05% in 2024 after strict control campaigns. And even if official Chinese numbers were tripled, it would still be a very low number, a pathetically low number compared to the West. And if you've ever been to China, you'll realize that this number is probably true, because the number of users in China is practically non-existent. It's very hard for someone to find anyone using drugs. Over there in Japan, it's another emblematic case. Drug use is a serious crime and social taboo here. Only 1.5% of Japanese people have ever used any illicit drug in their lives, compared to 42% in the United States, according to the survey. Specific data show that in Japan, methamphetamine use is around 0.4% of adults, while in the United States it reaches 11.9% and in the United Kingdom 3.7%. Similarly, marijuana use in Japan is minimal, with less than 1% of the Japanese population having ever used it, while in the United States about 30% have used it. These numbers illustrate a clear pattern where there is strict punishment and strong cultural disapproval. Consumption is radically lower than in more permissive societies. The top 10 countries in per capita drug use disorders are all Western, with the United States leading the population presenting abuse disorders, followed by Canada, New Zealand, the United Kingdom, among others. While countries intolerant to drugs keep the share of dependence well below 1, China has about 0.54% of the population with drug disorders. Japan with about 0.62, South Korea with 0.75, and the United Arab Emirates with 0.62, while Brazil has nearly 1, which I doubt is the full amount. And other Latin American countries are at an intermediate level, higher than the Asian countries, but generally lower than the Anglo-Saxon ones. The overdose or drug-related death rates in tolerant Western countries lead the ranking. The United States has by far the worst global rate, 324 deaths per million, followed by Western territories and nations like Puerto Rico, Scotland, and Canada. Meanwhile, countries with strict anti-drug policies report minimal rates. Notice, for example, that the Philippines, Saudi Arabia, Japan, and others barely appear on the chart, with rates between 1 and 6 per million virtually close to zero. The disparity in the lethal impact of drugs is striking. The United States is experiencing an overdose epidemic unparalleled in recent history, driven especially by the synthetic opioid fentanyl. In 2023, overdose deaths in the United States exceeded 100,000 for the third year in a row. An increase of more than 50% compared to 2019, with 324 annual deaths per million inhabitants. The American rate is the highest in the world by far, and other Western countries face similar crises on a smaller scale. Scotland, part of the United Kingdom, has Europe's highest rate at about 219 deaths per million. That's nearly 15 times the European average of 15 per million. Canada also suffers heavily, with 193 deaths per million. And even Western countries with smaller populations, like for example Iceland, Sweden and Ireland, reported numbers in the range of 80 to 100 deaths per million, much higher than Eastern countries. On the other hand, zero-tolerance nations practically do not face mass mortality caused by drugs. Many Asian countries report fewer than 10 drug-related deaths per million. Japan is around 6 per million, Singapore is practically zero, and China and South Korea have similarly tiny numbers. Singapore boasts one of the lowest rates of opioid abuse in the world, with about 30 opioid users per 100,000 inhabitants. In contrast, the United States has 600 per 100,000 inhabitants, which is reflected in the rare cases of fatal overdose. Two cases are cited as successful examples in the drug issue. They show that supposedly repression would not be the answer, with these examples being the Netherlands and Portugal. But that's another lie. Reports indicate that drug use has increased since decriminalization. The percentage of adults who had already used illicit drugs increased from 7.8 in 2001 to 12.8 in 2022. In Portugal, drug-induced deaths after an initial drop have risen again to levels higher than before decriminalization. Even more alarming is the collapse of public order. Recent reports highlight growing public disorder, with people openly using drugs on the streets and causing disturbances in residential neighborhoods. This has led Portuguese politicians themselves to express doubts about this policy. And the Netherlands is now practically a narco-state within Europe, serving as the main drug distribution hub to the United States. A first wave of abusive painkiller prescriptions in the 1990s evolved into a heroin outbreak in the 2000s and, starting in 2013, into a flood of synthetic fentanyl, resulting in an explosive scale of deaths. While Asian countries prevented major opioid crises through extreme prohibition, China, although a source of chemical precursors, did not face anything internally similar to the American epidemic. And it's no wonder the Chinese know better than anyone the damage caused by tolerance and legalization of drugs. Japan barely prescribes opioids and has strict control over precursors, preventing outbreaks, while Singapore and others apply capital punishment to heroin trafficking, discouraging its spread. Besides the numbers of consumption and deaths, there are very visible and strong social impacts between societies that are tolerant with users and those that are intolerant. In major cities in the United States, Canada, and parts of Europe, openly using drugs has become common. Cracklins or gatherings of users consuming on the streets, often accompanied by homeless encampments. San Francisco, United States, and Vancouver, Canada, are known for their public consumption zones, despite questionable harm reduction policies. A competitive report noted that cities culturally open to use also attract users from other regions, thus creating communities with tolerance to drugs, thus creating camps where open scenes of drug use can be seen. Nearly half of San Francisco's homeless population is estimated to have come from outside the city, attracted in part by the availability of drugs and tolerant services, resulting in a growing social burden. The same thing here in Brazil is also reflected in Cracolândia, in São Paulo, with people from other cities and even states going there just so they can use their drugs in peace, without being bothered by the police forces. These areas suffer from urban decay, property crimes, biological waste like discarded syringes, and an overload of health and social services. Meanwhile, you won't see scenes like this in Singapore, Tokyo, or Dubai. That's not even unthinkable, it's non-existent. The strict law prevents the formation of open markets. A user caught with drugs in Singapore is sent to compulsory rehab, regardless of consent, and repeat offenders may face prison. In Dubai, tourists can be arrested even for traces of drugs in their blood. Therefore, using drugs in public is unthinkable in these places, preventing the problems from being externalized to the rest of society. Thank you all, I hope you enjoyed it. And if you really like the World Geopolitics channel and want this kind of content to keep being made, consider becoming a member. Not only do you make sure the channel keeps existing, but you'll also get early access to the channel's videos and access to exclusive videos for members, like the History of India, Mongol Empire Geopolitics, the intelligence course I created for channel members, and more. And depending on the category, your name will even appear at the end of the video as a thank you. Consider this option as it really helps.